Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Hey, and thanks for listening in to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined today by Reverend Mark Feldmeir. Hello.
Hey there. Thanks for having me, Lauren. It's great to be with you today.
Yeah, looking forward to talking with you. So, Mark is the senior pastor at St. Andrew United Methodist Church in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. He's sort of a neighbor of mine. And he has served on the adjunct faculty at Claremont School of Theology, lectured at various conferences throughout the country on topics ranging from preaching, leadership, and pop culture, and is the author of 3 books. So welcome. What else would you like our listeners to know about yourself?
Well, I've been in Highlands Ranch at St. Andrew United Methodist Church since July of 2014. I'm a native of Southern California. I was born and raised there and served a couple of churches in Southern California. Most recently, served 8 years at a church in northern San Diego County in Encinitas, California. And prior to that, I served as a lead pastor of a new church plant for 12 years in South Orange County, California. So,
maybe we should talk about that instead. I need all the help I can get there. Tell our listeners a little bit about your journey of faith, how how it started out, what it looks like now, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was raised Catholic up until about the age of 14, and I know a lot of people who struggle with a tough history in Catholicism. But for me, the Catholic Church was a wonderful experience, and it helped me at a very early age integrate my experience of God and experience of faith practice into my everyday life. And as a child, I was always sort of preoccupied with spiritual things, and the Catholic Church helped me perceive the world as sort of spiritually charged. And so I found some great early spiritual formation in the Catholic Church. And then my family moved to a new community, and for various reasons, we didn't quite connect with the Catholic Church there, and that led us on a journey toward looking for another faith community, a faith home. And we landed eventually in the United Methodist Church, and that was an experience that helped connect my early spiritual understanding of the world with which was largely sort of inward focused and upward focused, to a more Wesleyan understanding of both the inward journey as well as the outward journey, or as Wesley described it, as personal piety and social practice of social mercy.
Well, Mark here is a good Methodist. He's already quoting Wesley here, referencing Wesley early on. Well, I guess, if I can ask, if you're willing to share, how would you describe your faith today? What does that look like for you? What's meaningful?
Yeah, what I would say is that the early experiences of faith, both in the Catholic Church, which was this focus on personal piety, and a more Wesleyan approach to this dual sort of focus on both inward piety and outwardly focused acts of mercy. I think where I'm at in my life today is trying to integrate those two in such a way that they're not separate, but that the very act of prayer can also be an act of mercy and justice in the world, and how our acts of mercy and justice in the world can be experienced by ourselves as well as by others as an act of prayer. I think we sort
Oh,
of
yeah.
we think in these dualistic terms, and we
Yeah.
categorize personal piety and acts of justice. When how do we come to understand that when we're doing acts of justice, we're doing it in prayer, as Bono would say, how do you turn a song into a prayer, right? Uh, um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think that's at this stage of my life. I'm 52. I'm trying to find ways to integrate those so that we don't go to church and say, okay, we're going to worship here, then we're out to the world and we're going to engage
Yeah.
socially out there.
Yeah.
But maybe maybe some of the deep social work we do happens in church when we stand up and state an affirmation of faith that says who we are and what we believe in. Um, and, um, and maybe some of the most prayerful things we can do are things like wash the feet of the poor and the marginalized. Those are
Yeah.
powerfully spiritual things to me.
Awesome. Talk about a spiritual practice that you've developed or might recommend others that was meaningful for you.
Of course, I have various routines and rituals that I try to incorporate into my daily life. I think what grounds it the most is daily prayer routine that maybe many of your listeners are familiar with. A resource, Common Prayer for Ordinary Radicals, and it's just it's a resource, a daily resource of simple liturgies and prayers and scripture readings with some other traditional sort of worship elements that is accessible and somewhat predictable, but that keeps me grounded. That's a spiritual practice, but I guess to my point earlier, what I'm really trying to do is understand that so much of what we do in response to God's call in our life is spiritual practice, and so. When I sit down with somebody in crisis, how do I understand that in this experience and encounter with the other, I'm being spiritually shaped as well? And how do I show up to that with a kind of compassion that not only I offer to the other, but that the other offers to me and shapes me? So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm more and more trying to ground myself in those experiences rather than seeing them as transactional, which so much of ministry these days can be.
Yeah. I appreciate what you're saying about if I'm hearing you right, like even if you're counseling someone in crisis, you're trying to see that as an opportunity for you to learn and grow as much from them. Oh, is that fair?
Yeah, and knowing that when we serve the other, we're serving Christ, and so if we see the Christ before us, that Christ has something to say to us and to speak into us. And of course, that's delicate, right? I mean, we're taught early to have boundaries, and but I think there's opportunity to see that experience as a holy encounter.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, the Common Prayer for Ordinary Radicals, that was called?
Yes.
Okay. Is it like a podcast type thing?
It's an actual physical book.
Okay.
And at one point there was actually an app that they had as well. And I think the app is no longer supported by Apple. But it's just a simple, 5 to 10 minute reading every day that includes simple liturgies and prayers.
It's funny. That's my first question. Is it an app?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your book. Mark is the author of A House Divided, Engaging the Issues Through the Politics of Compassion. I'm struggling to read it because the cover is a divided page and it's throwing off my visuals a little bit. But talk about kind of, in the book you write that this was brought about by a sermon series. So talk about kind of what prompted that sermon series and why, that's what I'd like to hear about, kind of what brought about that sermon series and kind of what your call was as a pastor, kind of teach that to your church.
Well, in the summer of 2018, as I do every summer, I go away for a few days and map out my sermon plans for the coming 12 months, including texts and sermon themes and titles. And that summer, I decided that there was a lot of division that we were experiencing in our country at the time, and I wanted to speak into that, and knowing that it's a sensitive matter when we discuss politics in church, and we mix faith and politics. But the reality is, if we don't claim those spaces and articulate a message about how our faith intersects with our experience of politics, then the world is already doing that, and the world will do it for us, and do it in ways that maybe that don't quite comply with our own understanding of the gospel. And so, these big issues, immigration, climate change, healthcare, LGBTQ inclusion, that are not only dividing our country but dividing our churches. How do we say that the church needs to speak to these, not of course in partisan ways, but in profoundly biblical ways, knowing that the Bible is not politically neutral. The Bible has a lot to say, for example, about the sojourner and the alien in our country. Like 96 commandments in the Hebrew Scripture alone speak to the proper care and treatment of the sojourner or the immigrant among us. And Jesus, of course, his very first sermon, as it's relayed in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, lays out very clearly that his mission is not one of the spiritual nature exclusively, but one that has profound political implications. So to proclaim release the captives in today's world, that might have something to do with prison reform, right? To recovery of sight to the blind, that speaks to issues of medical health care, to liberate the oppressed, to announce the acceptable year of the Lord. We're talking about poverty. We're talking about economic justice and forgiveness of indebtedness. These are powerfully political conversations that Jesus wants us to have. And yet we in the church, again, back to that idea of dualism, we try to separate spirit from body, heaven from hell, eternal life from this life. And that's not what Jesus was about. And so I wanted to do a sermon series in which we just address those issues and from a biblical perspective.
Awesome. And obviously, it eventually became into book form. But what I want to point out to our listeners is, as I mentioned from the top, Mark and I are neighbors in a way. We both reside kind of in the Denver metro area. Do you live in Highlands Ranch?
I do. I live in Highlands Ranch, and then Highlands Ranch is the church that I serve at St. Andrew here.
Yeah.
And,
so he lives in Highlands Ranch, which is on the far south suburb of the Denver. I am in Thornton, which is like a northeast suburb. So we're probably a good 45 minutes away from each other, like on a good day of traffic. But still, I know a little bit about Highlands Ranch. I've certainly been there a few times, and I want to just point out for our listeners, Mark, these things you're saying. We both work in mainline contexts, which have a tendency to be at least somewhat on the left end of the spectrum theologically and sometimes politically. So some of our listeners might be like, "Oh, that's really not that bold or courageous thing to say." But Highlands Ranch, folks, just take my word for it. Like, it's not quite Colorado Springs, if you know anything about Colorado Springs, but it's like the next. It's like I don't know if you'd agree, Mark, but I'd say it's like second there next. Pretty polar opposite, for instance, of like a Boulder, Colorado. So I'm curious, like, when you're doing this, like, you're a fairly large church, at least what I, from the outside, it perceives to be so. How was the community? What was the feedback from the community like? Has there been continued conversation? How has it impacted the community? I'm curious.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Highlands Ranch is is a southern suburb of Denver. I think it's fair to say it leans politically conservative. It's a very affluent,
Mm-hmm.
well-educated,
Mm-hmm.
upwardly mobile, mostly white community. It's for those that already have opportunity. It's the land of great opportunity, and and because of that, from the outside at least, you would think it's immune to some of the social problems that the rest of the world is facing. But it's not. It's just simply it's easier to whitewash them. It has the resources to whitewash some of those issues, and so that makes it really difficult to talk about things like racism when few people in our community are other than white. Right? It makes it hard to talk about poverty when few people here are going to bed hungry, and of course that I think that contributes to that fragility, right, that we hear about on a number of issues, and triggers people. So when to give you an idea of how either ironic or providential it was that on the very first Sunday that I started this series, I planned to preach on the topic of immigration. That was the same week in January of 2019 when the immigration debate really hit its boiling point with the separation of families at the border, images of kids in cages, and the rhetoric that was flying around. So talk about a very charged atmosphere that day. I had people emailing and calling and visiting me saying, if you do this, I'm not going to come to church. And yet what happened instead is, I think that first Sunday we were 28% over our annual or our weekly attendance. We average about 1,100 on a Sunday, and we were almost at 1,300 that day. And I'll admit, it felt like I was, doing the high wire act and playing with some TNT. But I also enjoyed that, and because I think what it communicates is the gospel has something to say about this, and and I'm going to do it in a way that's not abusive of my authority and my privilege as a pastor. And we're going to stick with some very simple, I call them the book axioms that we can all hopefully agree on, and build some momentum toward consensus and mutual understanding. I will say, that particular Sunday was very successful and got us going for 7 more weeks on some very difficult topics that followed. And what I'll say too is that I think what was very discernible was that those who were coming to the church for the first time because they heard about it from a neighbor or a colleague tended to be younger. And so what I learned from that is that that our younger constituencies, of course they care about spiritual things, but they care about the real world, and they want to know if God and the church still has something to say that's relevant to the world they're living in.
I'm thinking back as you were talking about that. You said 2019, right?
Yeah.
January 2019.
Yeah.
I feel like it was. Maybe this was. Well, I can't remember anymore. Maybe it was December of. Well, I guess December of 2018 would have been that same time frame. I remember like preaching and just referencing like God doesn't build walls or something, and getting like a visitor comment being like, "Hey, I don't come to church to hear CNN."
Yeah.
So I can only imagine what you might have heard.
And I sort of made reference to that same tension that we feel as pastors whenever something explodes on TV and we have to address it from the pulpit. We walk in with a great deal of expectation and pressure. And, in fact, just after the insurrection at the Capitol a couple weeks ago, it was interesting. I saw on Facebook somebody said, a colleague, if you're a pastor, this may be the most, important sermon you preach in your lifetime, right? And then underneath it were a bunch of comments from preachers who were saying, didn't we already have like 4 of those this year or 3 others the year before? And people joking, yeah, it's just another one until there's another once in a lifetime. And we open our mouths and we lose people. We say too much, we lose people. We say too little, we lose people. And yet we have to do it.
Mark, this is like turning into a masterclass just, on preaching. Yeah. So forgive me, we can talk about your book here eventually. But I'm thinking about, like, I was joking with somebody, I think probably on an interview here, about how, like, in my mind, there's 3 like clear, like, made for, that are going to turn into a movie events that's happened in the last, 12 months. Obviously the pandemic, there's going to be a movie. The unrest and Black Lives Matter, that's going to be a movie. Yeah. And then, like,
the insurrection,
the Wednesday the 6th, that's going to be a movie. So, and I know, like, I remember seeing myself, on Twitter. We're only a couple weeks removed from the events of January 6th, and the struggle of, and I think this is a thing that many pastors face, especially mainline pastors, is like, what do you talk about? How often do you change your message versus stick to what you're planning on preaching, trusting that God's message can still make an impact, whether it's speaking to something directly that happened last week or not.
Well, here's another reason why I preached the series that led to the book, and it's the reason I tell people all the time that we have to, from a pulpit, engage political issues in a fair and just way, and with great grace. But if we don't, then suddenly something does happen in the world and we have to speak to it. And then we find ourselves like every week speaking to another issue. And so we are reacting rather than creating the kind of culture that over time is able to hear what we are trying to say. And so I think, to that point, the series I preached in 2019 that led to the book, I think did help lay some foundation for having difficult conversations in church, and to model what that looks like so people aren't so anxious about it.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so for folks who are thinking, like, hey, how am I going to preach this? Ding, ding, ding. Mark has a book about it. So I'll get back on topic here, Mark, and we can talk about it. So you write in the book about a politics of love and compassion. And I'd like to hear you elaborate more about that and what that looks like.
Yeah, so the idea of a politics of compassion is really rooted in this word, compassion, that in Scripture you'll find it in, for example, the Lucan story of the Good Samaritan, that the Good Samaritan acts with compassion, and the Greek word there is a variation on splagnizomai is the Greek word. It's a wonderful mouthful. It comes from the root word splankna. It gives rise to what today we would call the spleen, but it really was understood mostly and used mostly as a reference to the gut, and the ancients believed that the seat of human emotion was not in the head. It wasn't even in the heart, but it was in the gut. And so even today we would say, for example, when I saw that particular tragedy, I felt my gut or my stomach twist in knots, or I had butterflies when I was nervous. Yeah. I mean, so the gut is something we want to pay attention to, because it's where we physically feel what we witness, and by accessing that place in us, we can then ask the question, what is it like to experience that? So for the Good Samaritan, what is it like to have been beaten and robbed and left by, not only robbers, but good religious people? And then that helps us then form an appropriate response. And so this splagnizomai, it generates in us the capacity to feel what's going on in the other person, and it gets us out of our head. And so much of our divisions today are ideological, and those emerge from a more cognitive place rather than a place of deep human emotion. So Simone Weil, the great philosopher, Jewish philosopher, said, the love of our neighbor in all its fullness simply means being able to say, what are you going through? What are you going through? And that's where I think we can begin to have conversations about, say, healthcare. And I've got a neighbor who's a friend of mine who's on the far opposite side of me on the issue of healthcare, on most issues. But we can argue about healthcare and land in ideological places and have all of our talking points lined up and walk away pretty bruised by it because we're not going to convert the other. Or we can say, in this case, Phil, what if you lost your job today, and you lost your health care, and your oldest son, was diagnosed with a fatal disease, right? What's that feel like, and how would we both walk through that together as neighbors? So that's an example of trying to find common ground by walking in common shoes.
Yeah, that's so good.
I'll say, right after the presidential election, Saturday Night Live, the host on that episode was Dave Chappelle, and I would really encourage your listeners to look it up and find it on YouTube and watch the opening monologue, because what he talked about was this idea that we experience so much of the same. So many of the same problems in the world, but we hate each other for it rather than, as he says, hating how it makes us feel. It was an amazing insight to say, we can all talk about racism, but unless we can say, it's not that I want to hate the one who's a racist, but maybe the healing of our country can begin around hating how that feels to be excluded. And frankly, what we saw on January 6th was, the evolution of a stockpile of grievances of mostly white people who are feeling like nobody's listening to them. It's far more complex than that, of course, but But Dave Chappelle's point was, until we can stand in those shoes, even for a few seconds, to say, what does it feel like to be those people? We can't understand their grievance.
Well, let me ask a question related there, and I'm glad it kind of fits well with the events of 1/6. So much of that was kind of, at least from my perspective, was spurred by what we'd call fake news, conspiracy theories. And certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, has been the rise of fake news and alternative facts and all that stuff. So much of your book, as I understand it, is kind of based on the word you use is axioms, these kind of like self-evident truths. So the question I've got to ask is, like, is there even such a thing anymore as axioms and self-evident truths in this world of quote unquote fake news?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good point. At this point in history in our country, we probably shouldn't make too many assumptions, about anything that seems self-evident to us that may not be to others. The question is, are we living in a post-truth world? I think maybe the next few years will tell us that a little more clearly. I mean, on the one hand, regardless of our partisan political persuasion, I think we'll likely still count on the fact that the sun rises in the west. We'll count on the fact that we shouldn't underestimate gravity if we're thinking of skydiving without a parachute. Some of these things are true, right? But we're living in a world in which I think so many of our old certainties and reliable truths are contested and called into question. I just, even though that's the case, I don't think we should give up truthful conversation. And
Sure.
and conversations that generate trust. And I think most of us aren't having those conversations. We're having monologues rather than dialogues,
Yeah.
and we're getting our truth. We're getting what we presume is self-evident truth from sources that are uniquely situated in the world to profit from untruth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I like your phrasing there, monologues versus dialogues. I mean, so much of social media is meant to be a monologue, and perhaps that's some of the challenge, right?
yeah, it's worse. It's an echo chamber.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Um. Oh, I was gonna drill down a little bit. Imagine you're speaking with another pastor, and they're like, "Hey, Mark, I want to talk. I want to use your book in a sermon series, but like, I've got like flat earthers. I mean, to me, that we could say like, hey, the sky is blue, the sun rises in the east, but then the Earth is round, and there's some people who just deny that the Earth is round. Um, do you have any advice for a pastor who's like, hey, I like this approach, but I'm even worried it's can my people then handle that? Like, what advice would you have?
I would begin with what I did when I preached the sermon series, which was it turned out to be a highly effective strategy, and that was to actually do a survey every week, the week prior to Sunday. So
Mm-hmm.
in my situation, I send out an email every Wednesday to the congregation, and that's usually sort of a glimpse of what I'm going to be preaching about this week, as well as some really important information that I want to share with the people. And so I would use that space to say, I'm preaching about the topic of immigration this coming Sunday. And we've created a very simple 6 or 7 question survey that we want you to participate in, so that on Sunday we can show you what you believe and what you in general.
Yeah.
And so that became a way for people to express what it is they do believe. It also gave me a chance to sort of gauge where people were.
Yeah.
And
That's
and then,
smart.
and not to water down what I wanted to say, but at least to acknowledge it. I know some of you here feel this way, and I know some of you feel this way. What I did find in my congregation here, which is highly politically diverse, I found that that there was great consensus around some of these issues, and far from what we are told in news media, that most people are there, not on maybe the particulars, but in general terms, there's more agreement than disagreement.
Yeah, it just goes back to what you said about there's sources whose incentive is to keep us divided. That's a great idea, though. Because I'm just thinking out loud here, and like, if you're sending me a survey, I'm already feeling like my voice is being heard, even if only on a small level.
Yeah.
Because the inverse would, I'd imagine, you probably still got this to some extent, but you're essentially like that kind of angry, like Monday morning or Sunday afternoon email about, oh, pastor, can't believe what you said. Like you're like preempting that in a way.
Yeah, and in our case, we have a big screen, so I could actually post the answers to each of those questions on the screen and point to them and say, this is where you are, and I hear you, and we're going to begin by acknowledging that that this is where you are, and your voice matters.
Yeah, because again, like you're saying, if you're here and you think differently, I hear you, I recognize you. I'm not gonna. So that's a great strategy, and I imagine you could probably do that even if you were a less tech savvy context. You could probably like put it in a bulletin the previous week and have people respond to the bulletin, drop it maybe in a box on the way out the door, and then assemble it to put it in the next week's bulletin type thing. Like,
Yeah.
I think that's such a great idea. All right. Last thing, let me ask you about the book is, you write about a goal of reclaiming our shared values as people of faith. So I guess the first question is, like, tell me why you think that's possible. Forgive me for being so cynical. And then what do you see as some of those shared values being?
So in the book, I talk about what I describe as three core commitments, which really are those shared values that I'm calling us um, to reclaim. And those three values are what I call kinship, kenosis, and delight. And these are the values that we see practiced in what Jesus called the basileia, theou, the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
And by kinship, we mean that um, we see ourselves belonging to one family, rather than moving into what today we experience as sort of tribalistic thinking, which weaponizes faith. And so, what we find in the Gospels is the kind of Jesus who who understands that the table is wide enough and long enough um, for everyone. And this is
Mm-hmm.
scary stuff in so many ways. But at the table is both the you know the Jew and the Greek, the
Mm-hmm.
slave and the free, right? The Roman soldier and the oppressed,
Mm-hmm.
and so what I describe here is this idea that the length and width of our table determines the depth and breadth of our compassion. And the bigger we grow that
Mm.
table, um, the more we find kinship there. Now that assumes one thing, and that is that those at the table aren't hurting
Mm.
their neighbors at
Yeah.
the table, and
Yeah.
that in churches we see it and experience this all the time, um, where people become hurtful, and that's when we say inclusion does have its limits insofar
Yeah.
as we begin to do harm. And so kinship is one. Kenosis, that we know, is the Greek word that refers to, as Paul describes Jesus as the one who empties himself, not using his privilege to serve himself,
Mm-hmm.
but using his privilege to serve others. And uh, and that in a culture today that is so focused on self gain
Yeah.
and winning,
Yeah.
uh, that's
Don't
hard to
preach to
do.
white America.
Yeah, uh, but kinship calls us, especially those of us who are white and privileged, uh, to use our resources to advocate and work for those, and to be allies for those who don't have that privilege. And the third is what I call delight, and it's one of my favorite words. But what I'm trying to get at here is this idea that we see the imago Dei, the image of God, in every
Mm-hmm.
person. In fact, in all of not only human but non-human life forms, and
Mm-hmm.
that insofar as it's true that God breathed God's Spirit at creation and created all living things, there is
Hmm.
there is something of God in all living things, and that calls us to see then that we can't objectify the other,
Mm-hmm.
because that other contains something of God. We can't demonize the other. We
Yeah.
can't scapegoat the other. So those are the three values that I'm calling the reader to reclaim. Is it possible? I don't know. I think the issue, it's not possible if we're talking about the form of Christianity called American Christianity,
Yeah.
which is distinct from and other than the kind of religion that Jesus of Nazareth practiced.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was principally concerned with love of God and love of neighbor. Those were the two primary loves. American Christianity is principally concerned with love of power and love of certainty, and
Yeah.
and so we have to surrender the American brand of Christianity, I think, to reclaim those values of the kingdom of God.
Yeah. Real quick before we move on, give me that length and width quote again. I think that's such a great image.
The length and width of our table determines the depth and breadth of our compassion.
With the caveat, if that's the right word, that sometimes not everyone can be welcome at the table for the sake of the safety of the rest of the people at the table. Such a hard dynamic, right?
Yeah, to do no harm, right? That's rule number one at the table.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break real quick, and we'll come back with some closing questions.
Hi there. My name is Brian Davis, and I'm the host of the podcast Chasing Sunday, a show that talks to worship leaders and other church creatives about the pain, frustration, and joys they face as they work in the relentless world of producing art for churches 52 Sundays a year. It's a show about burning out and burning bright. Together, we talk about how we can find a healthier and more creative alternative to chasing Sunday after Sunday. You can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
Looking for a progressive, inclusive church that allows you to ask questions, explore your faith, and connect with God? Check out Mission Gathering Thornton, a community of Jesus followers dedicated to growing in faith, living whole lives, and seeking justice for the good of all. As an online church with incarnational communities, we're meeting together online and in person with opportunities for you to connect with people across the street and all over the world. So visit us at mgthornton.org, find us on Facebook and YouTube. We'd love to have you be a part of this life-giving community.
All right, we're back with Reverend Mark Feldmeir. And Mark, I always tell people you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're Pope for a day, what do you want to do?
That's a great question. I am a huge admirer of Pope Francis, and I think he's got it right. Every chance you get, sneak out the back door and hang out with some hurting and real people. Go wash.
Sneak out the back door. That's good right there.
Yeah, go wash some feet, shed the robe, and put on your blue jeans and model, I think, what it looks like to love God and love neighbor, and make sure people see it, because being in that position of authority, I think, has powerful implications and consequences for the world.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. A historical I can't talk. An historical Christian or theological figure you would want to meet or bring back to life?
Well, probably like a lot of your listeners, I'm drawn to Dietrich Bonhoeffer for a number of different reasons, not just because he was a Christian martyr, a modern Christian martyr, but because he understood how good theology had political implications. And so to simply say that Jesus is Lord means, of course, that all other things are at least penultimate, or and I've lived with that, his work with other pastors and theologians in writing the Barmen Declaration. I found myself over the last few years returning again and again to that good theological work, which puts Christ back at the center of our conversation. I would also add, and this theologian's still alive, thank goodness, but is in his 90s. That's John Cobb. I studied at School of Theology at Claremont under John Cobb and David Ray Griffin, and came to love and appreciate process theology. And if I had a chance to sit down with John Cobb I'd love to talk more about, how process theology can speak into some of the divisions and issues that we're experiencing in our modern world. So,
Cool. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
There are two ways to go here, right? And one is to go down the possibly cynical route.
Yeah.
But what I'll say is, I think history will look back and say, we are a generation that had all the tools necessary for meaningful and deep connection and community. We have neighborhoods, we have churches, we have social media when it's used at its best. All these ways to be in touch and to care for one another. But nevertheless, we're probably the most lonely generation in American history. And why is that so? And so what we might be remembered for is how we took out that loneliness and the pain of loneliness on others by tribalistic warfare, and we hurt other people because of it. I think on a positive note, I would hope that history would say they acted just in time. It was almost too late, but they finally came around and they got it. They acted on social injustices. They acted on climate change, healthcare, these kinds of things.
Well, let's keep going with that then. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
Now, here's probably where a little humor is helpful.
Yeah, sure.
Honestly, we're long overdue for a reformation, a new reformation. And I think there are a number of implications for that. One being maybe the future Christianity looks like fewer clergy. We've kind of been in charge for about 2,000 years, and this is kind of what we've made of it. Maybe there's another strategy.
Mark, I'm going to confess I struggle with that one.
Yeah, and I think as pastors we all struggle with it a lot. But the future Christianity, again, I would ask the question: which Christianity? The one that Jesus practiced, or the one that is more Americanized and politicized and weaponized? I think it's time to reboot and return and rebrand. And none of us are prepared for that, because it means surrendering what little privilege and authority we still have in this modern world.
If this falls according to place, your interview is going to air after one I just had, and I think he gave a similar answer to that question. So I'm kind of wondering if something's in the water, so to speak, there. Yeah. Where can people find out more about you and then get the book?
Well, I preach almost every week at St. Andrew United Methodist Church in Highlands Ranch. We've got a pretty active virtual presence at this point, so it's pretty easy to find me, to listen and get to know me through my preaching. That's gosaintandrew.com. And then Feldmeir.com is my personal website, where I do a lot of blog postings, and you can find some chapters and videos on my book there, some good resources for small groups. And the book is available through Chalice Press, the publisher, as well as all your major Amazon, Barnes & Noble booksellers. So,
yeah, I definitely recommend folks check it out if you're looking to try to dive into tackling these kind of topics in a way that's going to be able to reach a broad spectrum of churchgoers. So, Mark, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation, and may God's peace be with you.
And also with you, Lauren. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. But hey, before you go, do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.